The Cursed Graveyard of Boulder, Colorado. There's a graveyard in Boulder, Colorado, that most locals don't talk about. Hidden on the outskirts of town, beyond the shadows of the Flatirons, it's a place where time stands still and the air grows colder the closer you get. The cemetery has no official name, just a reputation. If you stay past midnight, you'll never leave the same. Some say it's cursed. Others say it's haunted by something far older than any of the headstones. Sarah didn't believe in any of that. To her, stories about haunted graveyards were just urban legends meant to scare kids. So when her friends dared her to spend the night in the old Boulder cemetery, she accepted without hesitation. She loved proving people wrong, and this was just another chance to laugh in the face of superstition. Her friends dropped her off just as the last light of dusk faded into darkness. Armed with nothing but a flashlight and her phone, Sarah made her way through the rusted gates and into the cemetery. Weeds and wild grasses had overtaken the grounds, snaking around the cracked tombstones like skeletal fingers. The moon hung low, casting eerie shadows that seemed to shift and dance as she walked. She found a spot near an old, crumbling mausoleum and settled in. "This isn't so bad," she said aloud, trying to shake the unease that was creeping over her. The air was still, as if the entire world had paused to watch her. Hours passed, and nothing happened. Sarah scrolled through her phone, sending mocking texts to her friends. Still here. Not dead yet. She laughed to herself and glanced at the time, 11:45 p.m., 15 more minutes until midnight, the witching hour when, according to legend, the dead become restless. Sarah leaned back against the cold stone of the mausoleum, staring up at the sky. The stars seemed unusually bright, twinkling above her like silent witnesses. But then, out of the corner of her eye, she noticed something strange. The shadows. They were moving. She sat up, heart racing. The breeze that had been absent all night suddenly picked up, rustling the weeds and making the headstones creak. Her flashlight flickered, casting erratic beams of light across the graves. "Hello?" she called out, her voice shaking. There was no reply, only the wind whistling through the trees. But she could feel something, a presence. The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end as she scanned the area. The mausoleum she had been leaning against now seemed darker, as though it absorbed the moonlight rather than reflected it. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest, and she stood up, gripping her flashlight tighter. As she turned to leave, the ground beneath her feet felt wrong. It was soft, almost like it was shifting beneath her weight. Panic bubbled up inside her. She moved faster, but each step seemed harder to take, like the earth itself was trying to pull her back. Just as she reached the path leading out, Sarah heard a sound, faint at first, but unmistakable, a whisper. It was so low, so soft, that she couldn't make out the words, but it seemed to come from all around her. She stopped, heart pounding, straining to hear, and then she saw it, a figure, barely visible in the darkness, standing between the gravestones just ahead. At first, she thought it was a trick of the light, but the figure moved slowly, deliberately. It was tall, impossibly tall, its outline blurry, like it wasn't fully part of this world. "Who's there?" Sarah shouted, her voice cracking. The figure didn't respond. Instead, it began to glide toward her, silent, its shape flickering like a bad signal on an old TV. Terror surged through her, and Sarah turned to run. But as she did, her foot caught on something soft and cold. She looked down and screamed. A hand, pale and rotting, was emerging from the earth, its bony fingers wrapping around her ankle. She kicked and struggled, but more hands began to rise from the ground around her, clutching at her legs, her arms, pulling her down. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, filling her head with voices she didn't understand. The ground itself seemed to ripple, like the graveyard was alive and hungry. Sarah yanked her leg free, tearing herself away from the grasping hands. She bolted down the path, her breath coming in ragged gasps, her flashlight forgotten in the chaos. The gate, she had to reach the gate. But when she looked up, the gate wasn't there. The path twisted and shifted, leading her deeper into the cemetery. No matter which way she turned, the landscape seemed to change, the headstones moving, the trees closing in. She was trapped. She stumbled into an open clearing, her heart hammering against her chest. And there, in the center, stood the figure, but now she could see it clearly. Its face was a hollow void, its eyes black pits of nothingness. It raised a hand, and as it did, the ground beneath her opened up. Sarah screamed as she was pulled down into the earth. The last thing she saw before the darkness swallowed her was the figure, watching, silent and unmoving. The next morning, Sarah's friends returned to the cemetery, expecting to find her asleep by the mausoleum, ready to laugh off the night. But Sarah was gone. Her phone, her flashlight, and her jacket were all still there, but she was nowhere to be found. They searched the cemetery, called her name, but there was no trace of her. Weeks passed, and Sarah's disappearance became another unsolved mystery in Boulder. Some said she had run away, others whispered she had fallen victim to the curse of the cemetery. But late at night, if you stand near the old mausoleum, you might still hear the whispers, and if you're unlucky, you might see the figure standing silently among the graves, watching, waiting. Because once the cemetery takes someone, it never gives them back.